The north is cold and full of whispers.
The cold came up through the stone floor the way cold always came from Winterfell's deepest places, not as a temperature but as a presence. Something that had been sitting in the dark for a very long time and had learned patience. Bran had been at the top of the crypt stairs for nearly an hour. His legs didn't know it. His legs didn't know much of anything anymore. The torch and its wall bracket threw orange light down the first flight and then gave up entirely. Below the second landing, the dark was absolute. He had been dreaming of what was in that dark for 7 nights. Not imagining, he knew the difference now. In the weeks since the fall, the distinction had sharpened into something he could hold. The crow came with 3 eyes and a voice like roots, pulling through wet earth, and it took him down. Not to the crypts but through them, through levels no torch reached, past statues worn smooth of every face, down to a wall that was not a wall. A collapse of granite blocks that looked like pure accident until you stood before it long enough to notice. The lintel above the fall was intact and precisely fitted, and carved into it were marks too regular and too deliberate to be erosion. Angles, notches, a sequence of repeated elements that his dreaming fingers traced until the pattern lived in his hands like something he had always known. He had drawn them for Luwin 4 days ago, traced them with a stick in the ash around his hearth, carefully, from memory. Luwin had watched him draw and said nothing for a very long time. Then he had gone the particular color of a man who has heard something he would prefer not to have heard. That was when Bran had understood that whatever was behind that wall, Luwin already suspected it was real. The descent took 3 men and most of a morning. Luwin went first with a torch. Behind him came Hodor, carrying Bran in both arms the way he carried everything, without seeming to notice the weight of it, humming something low and formless. The third man was Cain. A household guard told only that the maester required assistance in the lower crypts, and that he should bring a pry bar. Cain asked no questions. He had stopped asking questions around Bran. The upper crypts smelled of cold iron, and something faintly sweet with no name attached to it. The lords of Winterfell watched from their alcoves, stone laps bearing the iron swords that kept them where they were. Bran knew every name, had made Luwin recite them twice in the weeks after the fall, learning them the way he now learned everything, with the ferocious attention of a boy who has recently understood that knowing things is not something you get to treat as optional. The middle level, older statues, cruder faces, less face at all. The lower level, no statues. The passage narrowed. The ceiling dropped 2 feet and 20 yards. Luwin's torch stretched thin and the smell changed. Not sweet, not iron, but something drier and more sealed, like the inside of a jar opened for the first time in an age. Then the wall, exactly as the dream had shown him. The fall of granite blocks appeared accidental until you stayed before it long enough to see what Bran saw, the fitted precision of the stones at the top and sides. The untouched lintel standing clear in the torchlight, with its carved angles and notches intact. Not accident, not age. A choice made by someone who wanted this sealed, and wanted it to remain sealed until the right person chose to open it. That lintel was placed deliberately, Luwin said. Not to Bran. To himself, in the voice he used when he was working something out and hadn't found the end of it yet. Cain looked at his pry bar, then at the wall, then at Luwin. Yes, Luwin said. Carefully, it took the rest of the day. Beyond the rubble the chamber was 20 feet square and not quite tall enough for Cain to stand fully upright. The cold hit Bran across the face as Hodor carried him through the gap. A dry cold, not the damp cold of deep earth. A preserved cold that felt like something had been sealed in here alongside everything else on purpose. His breath came out in short white plumes against the torchlight. He looked at what was inside and felt something in his chest that was not surprise. The 3-eyed crow had not shown him this room exactly, but the knowledge arrived as confirmation rather than discovery, the way a word you have heard your whole life looks correct the first time you read it written down. Ironwood frames, disassembled, each piece stamped with a carved rune Bran now understood was a position number in an assembly sequence. The wood was the dark color of old iron, and the smell of it was iron too, cold metal and pine resin, sharp and strange. When Cain lifted one of the smaller pieces to examine it, his arm dropped 3 inches with the unexpected weight. He set it down. He did not lift another. Rolled leather sheets, not parchment. Parchment would not have survived this. Thick and cured, almost rigid. Each filled with diagrams pressed in a dark pigment that had kept for whatever 8,000 years felt like at this depth. Bran had Hodor lower him close enough to get his hands on one. The diagrams were precise and patient. Pivot points. Tension ratios. Trajectory arcs laid out in a notation that was not common tongue and not quite the First Men runic from the Citadel's manuscripts Lewin had shown him, but something between the two. Something designed for engineering rather than prayer. A technical language. Written by people who built things. Lewin crouched on the vault floor with 2 sheets unrolled across his knees. His lips moved without producing sound. Sealed clay vessels stacked in the far corner, a dozen of them, each stoppered with a stamped rune. Lewin crossed the room to examine and identified aloud. The symbol for fire. From a Royce correspondence his predecessor had transcribed into Winterfell's records 40 years before. Not a warning against fire, a warning that fire was what the vessels held. Bran could smell it even through the clay, pine resin, cold and deep, and beneath that something else, something without a name he owned, something preserved and sharp like a wound healed over something still inside it. In the far corner, on its own low platform, one assembled piece. Half-scale. Incomplete, but complete enough to be recognizable as a working portion of the mechanism the diagrams laid out in full. Instructions, Lewin said. His voice had no color. This isn't a shrine. It is a specifications document. He looked up from the leather. In the torchlight, his face was the face of a man, measuring the distance between what he believed and what his eyes were giving him. Someone built something here and left directions for whoever came next. He was quiet for a moment. 3 days, he said. Give me 3 days with the diagrams. 3 days, Bran said. Before the sun had properly cleared Winterfell's eastern walls on the morning of the 3rd day, Hodor carried Bran out of the great keep and into the courtyard. Thin snow on the ground, the kind that arrived before winter's real weight, a dusting that hadn't decided yet. The sky was pewter and still. Lewin was already there in working clothes, the half-scale mechanism mounted now on a base of spare ironwood from the vault. 2 pieces from the numbered assembly finally joined into what Lewin had called, very quietly, past midnight. A functional test configuration. Cain stood to one side, 3 stable hands who had been told nothing and were asking nothing. Lewin loaded the mechanism himself, checked each tension point twice. His hands shook once and then stopped shaking. He stepped back. The release was not the sound Bran expected. He had expected something mechanical. The recognizable snap of a crossbow or the heavier thud of a siege weapon he had read about in Lewin's books. What he heard instead was a sound with mass to it, a low dense crack like the earth settling somewhere very deep and very final. The bolt, ironwood, 4 feet, the obsidian tip black as the bottom of a deep well. Crossed the 30 yards to the eastern courtyard wall in something less than a breath. It went through the wall, 3 feet of dressed Winterfell granite, and it passed through as if the stone were packed snow. The hole it left was clean and circular. The powder it left behind was fine and white and drifted in the still morning air before settling on the snow at the wall's base. From the other side, muffled by the stone and the 60 feet of open yard beyond, came the sound of the bolt finally stopping, embedding itself in the timber of the outer stables with a crack that sent the horses inside into brief, startled motion. Silence. Above the rookery, a single raven called once, did not call again. Lewin stood in the snow with his torch still burning in his hand, the flame working its way toward his fingers. He did not notice. He was looking at the hole in the wall. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned and looked at Bran. Bran looked back with the eyes he had had since the fall, the eyes that came from somewhere deeper than the place where a 7-year-old boy's thoughts usually lived. "We need to tell Robb," Bran said. "Movement above them." The rookery gate swung open and a raven dropped out of it into the cold morning air, came straight and low across the courtyard as if it had been aimed, and landed on Lewin's arm. Lewin read the message from the capsule at its leg. His lips moved. He went the color of old milk. My lord. His voice was stripped of everything it usually carried. Your lord father. He stopped. Began again. Lord Eddard has been taken. He is a prisoner of the queen. Bran looked at the hole in the wall. The white powder from the shattered granite was still settling on the courtyard snow. Fine as breath. He looked at it for a moment that felt longer than moments usually were. Then, tell Robb both things, he said. The ravens went out before dawn. Robb had not slept. He had gone from the courtyard, from the white powder on the snow and the clean hole in the wall and Lewin's face, directly to the maester's study. And he had stayed there through the night with the leather diagrams unrolled across Lewin's table and a candle that he replaced twice. He had studied the diagrams and thought about the bolt and thought about his father in a cell somewhere south of the neck, and he had tried to find the trick in what he had seen in the courtyard. The part that explained it away. There was no trick. By the 4th hour he understood what the ravens would say. Most went south with the standard summons, every lord, every bannerman, bring your men, bring them armed, bring them now, for the Lord of Winterfell is taken, and the North does not forget. The words his father would have written. Robb had Lewin read the draft aloud twice. It sounded like Ned. He needed it to sound like Ned. 2 ravens went differently. The first to Deepwood Motte, to Lord Galbart Glover, in Robb's own hand, because what he was asking required the Lord's name and not the maester's, with a message that said, bring your woodcutters, your joiners, every ironwood saw blade in your stores, and every man who knows how to use one. Bring your men at arms last. The second to the Wolfswood settlements nearest the Forester groves, addressed to the headman of each, asking the same thing in simpler words. He sent those 2 before the others. The bannermen would take 3 weeks to arrive. The Wolfswood men needed to start today. The lords arrived in stages across the following weeks, each one riding through the Winterfell gate, expecting to find what northern war councils had always produced: columns of spearmen, organized steel, the familiar machinery of feudal assembly. They found something else in the courtyard. Lewin had the prototype there for the first 3 days of arrivals, not to demonstrate it, not yet, just present. Sitting on its low ironwood base at the yard center, a thing with no name in a space where men were still sorting tent arrangements and counting arrows. The lords looked at it and looked away. They told themselves they would ask Robb what it was. Robb was always in the middle of something else when they thought to ask. The Greatjon Umber arrived on the 9th day. He crossed the yard in his usual manner, which was to say he crossed it like a man who had limited awareness that anyone else was using it, and he walked to the yard center and stopped and looked at the prototype. He did not look away. He walked around it slowly, all the way around, taking his time, studying the ironwood frame from each angle, saying nothing. He stopped and kicked it with his boot, the enormous umber boot that had broken a man's shin during summer training 2 years past. The boot rang against the ironwood like iron striking iron. He crouched down and examined the tension mechanism with the attention of a man who had spent his life identifying things that could kill other things. He was quiet for a very long time. When Robb came out of the great keep, the Greatjon was still crouched there. "My lord," Robb said. "What," said the Greatjon without turning, "is this?" Not a shout. The Greatjon had a voice engineered for shouting, a voice that could carry across a battlefield and reach both flanks without effort, and he was not using it. That was what told Robb this conversation was going to matter. Robb told him. The crypts, the vault, the sealed lintel, the leather diagrams with their notation that was not quite any language Lewin had a name for. What the half-scale prototype did to the eastern wall of the courtyard, what the full-scale specifications promised it would do to something larger. He told him about the first men, and what they had been fighting when they built these engines. And what kind of enemy requires you to design a weapon that fires obsidian-tipped ironwood bolts because nothing else will stop what's coming at you. The Greatjon was still for a time so complete and so sustained that Robb had the brief unsteadying thought that the man might have stopped breathing. Then, he said, still looking at the mechanism, "Show me what it does." The ironwood came down out of the wolfswood, in sections hauled on sledges by oxen working in relays, because no single team could sustain the weight through a full shift. The cutting had started 4 days before the first bannermen arrived. The Forester men were already in the trees when Robb was still dispatching the standard summons, which was deliberate. This could not wait on councils. The sound of the wolfswood cutting carried to Winterfell on still mornings. Not the sound of trees falling, that happened rarely, and when it happened slowly, which surprised every cutter who expected something faster. Ironwood resisted the axe the way dense stone resisted a chisel, each stroke giving back only a sliver of the blade's effort. A dull axe bounced off entirely. A sharp one bit half an inch and stopped. The men learned to rotate blades 3 times as often as they would on oak, and they came home with arms that ached from wrist to shoulder, and they learned what cut ironwood smelled like, cold iron and pine resin, and something beneath both that had no name. Something that made the inside of the nose tingle the way winter air did when it first turned genuinely serious. Joiners came behind the cutters. They worked from numbered diagrams Lewin had copied onto fresh leather. The vault originals were too fragile for field conditions. Each piece was cut to specification and stamped with its assembly rune before it came south to Winterfell. The only way to manage it, 1,000 men in a forest, producing components for a machine none of them had ever seen complete. Using a numbering system derived from a notation 8,000 years old. It worked. That was the fact that sent Lewin quiet for a full hour when the first full ironwood frame came together in the Winterfell yard. It worked exactly as the specifications said it would, which meant the specifications were correct, which meant whoever had written them understood something about ironwood tension ratios and load distribution that the Citadel had never learned, had never been told, and therefore had never taught anyone alive. Robb watched the frame rise and thought about his father. Not his father in a cell somewhere below the Red Keep. His father in this yard on winter mornings, teaching him the sword in the gray dawn light, never raising his voice, patient in the particular way of men who have seen enough failure to know what impatience costs. Ned Stark had walked past the entrance to the vault every day of 17 years of lordship and never known what was beneath him. He pushed the thought down. He had things to do. They tested the first complete engine on the 14th day of the assembly against a decommissioned watchtower at the western edge of Winterfell's outer wall. A squat structure of northern granite, 300 years old, that nobody had used in living memory. Robb had it emptied the morning before. He assembled the full host in the yard by midday, 18,000 men in rough formation, the bannermen at the front, the engineers and wolfswood cutters behind, the lords at his left and right. The Scorpion sat on its wheeled ironwood platform, tension arm locked back, the obsidian-tipped bolt seated, and ready. Lewin stood at the mechanism with 2 Forester joiners who had learned the loading sequence fastest. He had chalk dust on his hands. His robes were swapped for a working cloak. He looked at Robb. Robb looked at the tower. 60 yards. 12 feet of dressed Winterfell granite laid without mortar in the old style, relying on weight and precision alone. He had grown up looking at that tower from the yard. He had never once thought about what it was made of, or whether what it was made of would stop something arriving at speed from the outside. He said, "Fire." The crack was the loudest sound he had ever heard that had not come from a thunderstorm. It hit the assembled host below the chest, somewhere sound did not usually reach. And it briefly stopped their thinking. Every man in the yard went still in the same instant. The tower absorbed the bolt. 3 seconds of silence. Then the face of the tower simply fell away. A clean vertical section, 10 feet high, 4 feet across, toppling outward in one piece, and striking the ground so hard the impact ran up through the snow and into the soles of every boot in the yard. Behind the fallen face, visible now in the exposed interior, the bolt was buried past its obsidian tip into the back wall. It had passed through the full diameter of the tower and embedded itself in the far granite without losing enough force to exit. 12 feet of northern stone. Dust rose and spread in the still winter air and did not settle quickly. Nobody spoke. Then, from the rookery above, every raven in Winterfell's towers lifted at once. 40 birds, 50, dark against the pewter sky, their calls running together into a single formless sound that crossed the yard and went north, absorbed by the wolf's wood and the cold and the distance, until there was nothing. Robb watched them go. He thought, this is what they were built for. Not Lannister walls, not towers, something else, something that had not come yet but was already moving, somewhere beyond the edge of what anyone this far south had begun to think about. He pushed that thought down. He had a war to start first. He had crossed worse ground than this. That was what Mern told himself in the first hour on the causeway, when the smell hit them. Rot and sulfur and standing water and the particular sweetness of vegetation that had been dying in place for centuries without anyone removing it. The horses didn't like it. His destrier had been in 3 pitched battles and 2 sieges and had never once shied from anything, and it didn't shy now, but its ears were doing something they did not normally do. He gave it nothing. No heel, no reassurance, because reassurance on uncertain terrain taught horses that uncertain terrain warranted reassurance, and he needed this horse thinking it was fine. The neck was not fine. He had 60 men behind him, 20 knights, 40 mounted infantry, selected for reliability rather than courage because courage was common, and he needed men who would hold their formation and report accurately rather than men who would do something distinguished and die proving it. They moved in 2 columns with 8 feet between them, which was the maximum the causeway's width allowed. Ahead, the road narrowed and curved left around a stand of marsh grass taller than a mounted man's head, so that the world reduced to what was immediately ahead and nothing else, which was exactly what a sensible enemy would use if they wanted to contain a column of cavalry. Mern had noted this in the first 10 minutes. He noted everything. Lord Tywin had not sent him here to come back with impressions. What Lord Tywin had sent him here to do was find the machines. The intelligence was contradictory and inadequate, and Mern had said so before departing. Intercepted ravens mentioned machines. They mentioned ironwood and craftsmen and a sound that the ravens' authors could not describe to each other's satisfaction. The scouts sent before Mern's company had not returned. Mern had been told this as context rather than as warning, which was its own form of information about how Lord Tywin was currently reading the situation. He did not think about the scouts who had not returned. He thought about the causeway and the marsh grass and the road that curved left. And he kept his formation tight and his pace consistent and his eyes moving. 2 miles onto the causeway the sound stopped every thought he had. It arrived first as vibration, felt in the chest before the ears resolved it, a resonance, low and sustained and mechanical, the sound a bowstring might make if a bowstring were 12 feet long and wound to the tension of something that should not be possible to wind that far without breaking. 1 note. Held, then the release, a crack that arrived half a second later with the weight of something very large happening very fast, and the bolt was already gone before the sound finished traveling. He turned in his saddle. The knight at the column's head had been Sir Willem Price, a reliable man, good seat, good armor, who had ridden 3 tournaments and placed in 2. Sir Willem was no longer on his horse. Neither was his horse. The horse had gone down without producing a sound, without rearing, without any of the things horses did when they were dying. It had simply stopped existing as a standing object and become a thing on the ground, the bolt through its neck so clean and so sudden that it had not understood what happened to it before it was already over. The bolt had not stopped at the horse. It took the second knight through the pauldron at the shoulder and the shoulder with it, and kept going. He spun. He did not make a sound either. The third knight it took through the chest, through the steel of a breastplate that had turned a lance in a tournament 3 summers ago, and the breastplate contributed nothing. And the knight contributed nothing, and the bolt kept going. The fourth knight at an angle through the hip, the fifth it pinned to his horse, through the lower leg and through the saddle, and into the horse's barrel, and the horse took 2 steps sideways and then folded at the knees. 5 men in a line with 1 bolt through all of them. Then, silence. Mern's destrier had not moved. He had not told it to stay still. It had decided on its own that stillness was the correct response to whatever had just happened, which was the decision of an intelligent horse, and he had no argument with it. He looked at the marsh grass running parallel to the causeway on the left side. Reeds, tall and dense, moving slightly in a wind too light to feel. He could see nothing inside them. He had heard one sound. He had seen one effect. 60 men were sitting their horses behind him, and not one of them had spoken. Sir Willem Price's destrier was still twitching. The bolt was embedded in the causeway wood, 10 feet beyond the last pinned knight, 2 feet into the timber, the obsidian tip black as volcanic glass, the ironwood shaft the color of old blood. 4 men were dead. One was alive and making a sound he would not make for long. Mern looked at the bolt, then at the marsh grass. He looked for a long time. Then he said, "Ride." He arrived back at the Riverlands in 11 days, having killed 2 horses to do it. His column had lost 6 more men to the neck, not the machines, the terrain, to horses that went off the causeway in the dark, because he had made the decision to move at night, and the decision had cost him. And he had made it anyway, because the causeway at night was better than the causeway in daylight, with whatever was in those reeds able to see him clearly. He ate nothing for the first 4 days. His stomach was not in a condition to receive food. He went directly to Harrenhal because that was where Lord Tywin was, and he went directly to Lord Tywin because that was what you did when you had something that could not be committed to a raven. Tywin received him in the map room. It was evening, candles lit, 2 lords of the Westerlands in attendance, a maester in the corner with parchment and ink. Mern told him what he had seen. He started with the sound, the thrum, the resonance, because the sound arrived first, and because he had no better place to start. He described it as accurately as he could, which was not accurately enough, because the sound was not a thing that language had been built to carry. Then the bolt, then the line of men and horses. He stopped. Tywin looked at him. He had said nothing during the entire account. The lords to his left and right had exchanged a glance at some point in the middle of it. Tywin had not exchanged anything with anyone. He had watched Mern's face with the specific quality of attention he applied to things that required revising his understanding of the world, which was not an attention Mern had ever been its object before, and which was deeply uncomfortable in a way that sitting in the neck for 11 days had not been. Tywin said, "How large was the frame?" Mern raised his hands and held them apart. Approximating what he had glimpsed through the reed grass in the half-second before he gave the order to ride, the ironwood structure mounted on a raft of lashed reeds, the scale of the tension assembly, the height of the frame above the waterline. Tywin looked at the space between Mern's hands. He said nothing. The room was very quiet. The candle nearest to Tywin Lannister burned without flickering, because the room was sealed against drafts, which was the way Tywin preferred to work, and the light it produced was steady and even, and showed everything in his face with perfect clarity. The lords in attendance had served under Tywin Lannister for a combined 40 years. Between them they had watched him receive the news of the Rain uprising. They had watched him receive the report of Aerys's madness. They had watched him absorb reversal and threat and betrayal and every category of difficulty that a life in Westerosi politics could produce. And in all of it his face had done one thing. It had processed, concluded, and moved to the response. What was in his face now was not the response. It was the processing. It was Tywin Lannister, for the first time in 40 years of those men's service, still inside the calculation, still finding the edges of it, still determining what the equation was before he could begin to solve it. Mern lowered his hands. Nobody spoke. The candle burned. She had negotiated with Walder Frey once before. She knew what that meant. The smell of his hall, mutton fat and old rushes, and the particular sourness of a stone room that had held too many bodies across too many decades without being properly aired. The way he watched from his chair at the head of it, eyes sharp and small in the loose flesh of his face, cataloging every gesture for what it could be traded for. The way he always made you wait, and always made the waiting feel like the negotiation had already begun before you sat down. She had come away from it the first time having given Robb's hand. She was not giving Robb's hand this time. His instructions had been specific. He had told her in a conversation that lasted 6 minutes. Sitting across from her at a Riverlands farmhouse table, 3 days south of Moat Cailin, his voice flat and unhurried, the voice he had been developing for 4 months that sounded nothing like the voice he'd had before the engines, before the vault, before Ned's arrest. He said, "Tell Lord Walder we need to cross his bridge. Tell him he should come to the south bank first. Tell him to bring his chair if he needs it." She had waited for more. He looked at her as if more was unnecessary. She understood what he meant when she arrived at the south bank and turned to watch what was coming down the King's Road behind her. She sent the request through a gate rider and waited near the bank for Walder to comply, which she expected to take some time because Walder complied with things on his own schedule and always had. She stood at the river's edge in her riding cloak and watched the green fork move, brown and cold, carrying the first ice skins at its edges now that the season had committed, and she listened to what was coming before she could see it. The wall breaker in motion did not sound like a siege engine being transported. It sounded like something older and slower, the creak of ironwood under enormous latent tension, the rhythmic groan of a wheeled platform's axles carrying a weight they were designed for, but that made itself known at every imperfection in the road. The smell arrived before the machine did, carried on the wind off the King's Road, pine resin and cold iron. Then the machine came around the river bend, 40 feet long on its wheeled bed, the throwing arm folded back against the frame, dark ironwood rising and falling slightly with the road surface. And beside it, the giants. She had known they were there. Robb had told the full council, had told it with Lewin's careful framing about the Weirwood connection and Bran's role in whatever had drawn them to Winterfell's yard. She had listened and filed it in the category of things she was still working on accepting. She had not seen them clearly in the column's formation, had always been at the wrong position, the wrong angle. Seeing them in the open beside the wall breaker was something the council meeting had not prepared her for. They walked upright, not stooped as the old stories had suggested. The larger stood perhaps 13 feet, the smaller 11, both moving with a gait that was not quite a man's, and not quite anything she had a word for. Something that carried its own gravity, its own pace, indifferent to the speed of everything around it. Their breath came in slow clouds in the cold air. They did not look at the river. They looked at the machine they walked beside with a calm, proprietary attention, as if they had always known it was there, as if they remembered it from somewhere very old. Behind her, the creak of a chair being carried across wood planking. Walder Frey had come to the south bank. He was smaller than she remembered. 90 years had continued the project they had been working on for decades, the slow compression of the man, flesh settling over bone, the whole structure shrinking towards some final form. He was wrapped in so many layers against the cold that his shape was largely hypothetical. But his eyes had not changed. They moved from Catelyn to the wall breaker, then to the giants, then back to the wall breaker, and they stayed there. He said nothing. The machine halted 60 yards from the bank with a groan of ironwood settling under its own release tension, the timing so precise that Catelyn understood Robb had calculated this arrival days ago and held it within minutes of schedule, which was itself a statement about what kind of army crossed his roads now. The giant stopped beside the frame. The smaller one turned its face toward the river and looked at the twin towers across the water with an expression she could not read at all. Walder Frey's mouth was moving, not producing words. The motion was involuntary, the way hands moved without instruction when the mind was occupied entirely elsewhere. Robb rode up alongside her and stopped his horse. He looked at the old man looking at the machine and let the looking go on as long as it needed to. He had learned patience in 4 months, or something that served the same function, the stillness of a man who holds the stronger position and is not in a hurry to announce it. "Lord Frey," he said, "we need to cross your bridge." Walder's mouth stopped moving. His eyes came to Robb, this boy, this 15-year-old lord with mud on his boots and cold in his face, with an expression doing several things at once. "What," he said, "is that thing?" "A reminder," Robb said, "that the Green Fork can be crossed in more than one way." The old man's eyes returned to the wall breaker. His mind was working. Catelyn had sat across from it working and knew its quality, adding up what a machine that size could do to a castle that size. Running the calculation against 90 years of accumulated understanding of where power lived and what it cost to hold. The ironwood frame, the folded throwing arm, the dark-stained launch platform. The tension assembly locked and still and waiting with an absolute patience that the machine shared with nothing else in the world she knew. It took him less time than she expected. "Supply contracts," Walder said. His voice had found its usual quality again, thin and precise and entirely transactional, the voice of a man who had renegotiated his terms before anyone could see him doing it. My granaries feed your column for the crossing. 5 days, minimum, above market rate. He paused. And gold. Not a promise of gold. Half before and half when the last engine clears your northern tower, Robb said. Walder's eyes moved to him. That's what I was going to say. Then, we agree. Walder Frey sat in his chair on the south bank and looked at the wall breaker, and did not look pleased, and did not look defeated. He looked like a man who had spent a very long life determining which direction the current ran before committing to anything, and who had just read the current's new direction with his own eyes, and found it unambiguous. The calculation was complete. The terms were acceptable. 90 years of survival had not been built on the refusal to renegotiate. It had been built on knowing exactly when renegotiation was the only rational position left. Catelyn rode to the far bank and stopped on the northern side and watched the engines cross. Each one took 20 minutes. The twins' bridge, Freystone, built to last because everything the Freys built was built to generate revenue, and revenue required durability, groaned at the entry of each platform. The sound began deep in the bridge's foundations and rose through the stone and could be felt through her horse's hooves a full second before it reached her ears. Frey engineers stood on the bridge ramparts watching with the fixed expressions of men who had been told not to intervene and were not entirely sure they could have intervened regardless. The engines cleared, one by one, each platform rolling north at a pace slightly faster than walking, each one trailing its smell of pine resin and cold metal, each one leaving wheel ruts in the bridge road surface that would be filled before the week was out. She watched Robb at the crossing's midpoint, sitting his horse to the side of the road, watching each engine pass with the specific attention of a commander verifying a timeline. She studied his face in profile. Ned's jaw. The Tully coloring from her side, the copper in the hair, but the bone structure was Ned's, and the stillness was Ned's, and the way he sat a horse with the weight slightly forward was Ned's in every particular. She had watched Ned make men do things they did not want to do. Not often Ned had preferred consensus, but, when it was necessary, he had done it. And there was always something in it she recognized, and that cost her something to watch, because it required him to use a part of himself he did not enjoy using. Robb had not seemed to find the using of it costly. That was what frightened her. Not the machines. Not the giants walking north through Frey land without asking permission. Not even Walder's expression on the south bank, which she had watched resolve from disbelief into transactional acceptance in under 2 minutes. Robb's face, the economy of it, the way he had said then, "We agree," and meant it completely, and moved on. She loved him more than she could account for in words she owned. She was afraid of who was making him. On the northern tower rampart, a young Frey soldier leaned over to watch the last wallbreaker pass below him. He was perhaps 16, with the look of a boy who had joined Lord Walder's garrison because it was steady work, and the twins had not seen real violence in living memory. He was looking down at the ironwood frame, with his mouth slightly open. Tracing the dark staining on the launch platform, the frost fire residue, black-edged and cold-scorched, the mark of something burned at a temperature nothing he knew fire from had a right to produce. He looked at it a long time. Then he raised his right hand and crossed himself. Not the star traced on the chest, not the Septon's blessing, not the Seven's fashion. The older sign. 2 fingers touching forehead, then chin, then the left shoulder, the gesture his grandmother's grandmother might have taught before the old ways finished fading south of the neck. The sign against something the Seven offered no protection from. The sign that meant, "I do not know what this is. I know what it is not." The wall breaker rolled north beneath him and did not look back. He saw the northern horsemen forming in the tree line 300 yards ahead and made the correct decision. He did this calmly and without ceremony, the way he made all tactical decisions. Read the ground, read the spacing, estimate the numbers, run the calculation against what he had, arrive at the only sensible answer. The wood was wrong for cavalry. Trees too close, ground too soft, the late afternoon light coming through bare branches at a low angle that threw long shadows across everything, and made depth judgment unreliable. These disadvantages applied equally to both sides. The difference was that the northern horse had formed up, which meant they had chosen this ground, which meant they expected him to do something. He would do that thing faster than they expected. It was the answer to ambush that had worked for 3,000 years. Column, he said. His destroyer knew the word and adjusted. Full advance. Break through the center, scatter left on my command. 600 knights behind him, the finest cavalry the Westerlands had produced. He had drilled them himself. He had one anxiety about the trees spacing on the left flank, which he had already adjusted for in the scatter command's timing. He had no other anxieties. He gave the signal to advance. The whispering wood accepted them. The sound of the charge changed when the trees closed in, hoofbeats coming back off trunks from all sides, multiplied and distorted. The usual thunder of heavy cavalry compressing into something tighter and more disorienting, a wall of sound pressing in equally from every direction. His destroyer's ears were working. It did not break stride. 200 yards to the northern line. 150. The thrum came at 100. It arrived first as a vibration in his sternum. Not heard, but felt. The body registering something the ears had not yet resolved, and then the sound completed itself in the same half-second as the bolt. Both arrived together, the flat resonant crack of the release, and the bolt taking his destroyer through the neck in the same instant of the same breath. The horse did not slow. It stopped. The distinction mattered enormously at a full gallop. Slowing was something a rider could absorb. Stopping, at that speed with that mass, was not stopping. It was 600 kilograms of horse and armor ceasing to be a component of the equation, while the forward momentum continued traveling in the direction it had been traveling. Hamay was airborne before he understood the horse was down. He was turning without having decided to turn. He had time to think, with the particular clarity that extreme situations always produced in him, that this was going to hurt in a way he would remember. The ground took him on his left side, shoulder, then hip, then the side of his helmet against a root that rang inside his head like a struck bell. Leaves in his face, grit between his teeth. The cold of the forest floor pressing through his armor into his ribs, and the immediate, specific, informative pain of two of those ribs making a decision they could not reverse. He lay still. This was not defeat. This was information gathering under adverse conditions. He stared up through the whispering wood's bare branches at a sky the color of old pewter and took inventory. The ribs, 2, definitely, possibly 3, each breath caught at the same point and cost more than breathing usually cost, which was manageable for a man not presently required to do anything that required full lung capacity. His sword arm intact, his legs intact. The left ear ringing from the root or the impact or both, which he filed as a problem for later. Around him, the wood was full of sound. He lay still and listened and counted. 6 distinct mechanical sounds, staggered, not simultaneous, each one the same fundamental quality, the same resonant crack, but spaced irregularly in a pattern that was not a volley. A volley was coordinated. A volley was one release on one command. What he was hearing was 6 independent operators making 6 independent decisions about when their mechanism was tensioned and ready, which meant the rate varied by the competence and speed of 6 different men and not by the mechanism's inherent cycle, which meant he could hear his cavalry. Not charging, not fighting, moving in the wrong direction at the wrong speed with the wrong sound, horses trying to maneuver in a space that had become very wrong very quickly, men making decisions under conditions they had not trained for. He catalogued this separately and set it aside. He would need the numbers later. The firing continued. He counted sequences, tried to estimate spacing between the 6 sources. Angles were difficult from flat on the ground with trees interrupting the sound, but the 2 leftmost were closer together than the others, and the rightmost was elevated, suggesting a rise he had not identified in his pre-charge assessment, which was a failure he noted without emotion, because emotion about failures during failures was a luxury he had never been able to afford. The inconsistency was the thing that did not resolve. Not in the mechanism, in the operator. Each of the 6 had a different cycle time. Some loaded faster. One had a perceptible hesitation between sequences, a pause of 2 or 3 seconds beyond the others, which could be technique or could be a mechanical adjustment being made in the field. If this were a purely mechanical system, the cycle times would be identical. They were not identical. 6 human beings were making 6 individual decisions, which meant this was not just a machine. It was a system with training and judgment and an accumulated institutional understanding of what worked, built up by someone who had spent time. He did not finish the thought. Robb Stark was standing over him. He had not heard him arrive. He heard everything. He had spent his entire adult life in a profession where not hearing things was how you died, and he had not heard Robb Stark cross the leaf cover of the Whispering Wood and stop 3 feet from his left shoulder. The boy moved quietly for a king. He looked 15 from this angle. He looked younger, actually, younger than the stories reaching south had prepared anyone for, younger than the tower-breaking, machine-carrying thing described in Tywin's dispatches. Brown hair, Tully coloring, Ned Stark's jaw, a sword at his belt that he had not drawn, 6 riders behind him in a loose formation with swords drawn, which was the sensible arrangement of threat. Enough to be unambiguous, not so many as to be theatrical. Jaime looked up at him from the forest floor and assessed his options. 2 seconds. No useful alternatives. "I cannot feel my left leg," he said. It was not true. His left leg was one of the functioning things, but it established the parameters of the conversation without requiring him to announce surrender formally, which he was not prepared to do. Robb Stark looked at him with an attention Jaime recognized from one other person on Earth, the quality of someone who knows you are lying and is deciding whether the lie is worth engaging. "Your leg is fine," Robb said. "You don't know that. I can see your boot moving." Jaime looked at his boot. His boot was doing something independent of his instructions. He stopped it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he set it to the sky above the bare branches rather than to Robb's face, because the sky was easier to be honest with. 6 of them. In the tree line. His voice was level. His ribs made each word cost a fraction more than words usually cost. The firing rates are inconsistent, which means human operators. Which means you have trained them long enough that each has developed individual technique. A breath. I spent the last 2 minutes working that out from the ground. I have no name for the mechanism itself. Robb Stark was quiet. Then he said, "Neither did the Long Night." Jaime looked at him then. Properly, at the face and the stillness and the 15 years of age that somehow produced this quality of certainty. He had known kings, had served one, had watched his own father become one in every way that mattered while holding a different title. He knew what certainty looked like when it was performance. He had performed enough of it himself to recognize the difference at range. This was not performance. That was the most alarming fact about the entire afternoon. More alarming than the sound he had no name for. More alarming than 6 men on the ground between the tree roots and the bolt embedded in the causeway wood of the Whispering Wood where his destroyer's neck used to be. He said nothing. Robb said, "Can you ride?" Jaime ran the assessment. The ribs would make it unpleasant. The ears ringing would make balance imprecise. Nothing was structural. "Yes," he said. They shackled his wrists in front of him, which was correct. It preserved riding function while eliminating sword function, and it was exactly what he would have specified in their position. They put him on a northern horse, a sturdy, cold-eyed animal indifferent to him, in the way northern horses were indifferent to everything south of the neck. The 6 riders formed around him without a specific arrangement being given, which meant either they had done this before or they had been briefed thoroughly. Both possibilities were interesting. He rode north in the column. The Whispering Wood moved around him on both sides. Through the trees, at intervals, he could see the engines working through the spaces between the trunks, their ironwood frames dark against the failing afternoon light, their platforms rolling north at the pace of something that had no concept of urgency, because urgency implied that the outcome was in question. He kept looking at them through the trees. The rate of fire, the inconsistency between the 6 operators, what it implied about the training time, what the training time implied about how long this had been in preparation, what the preparation implied about what was still coming. He kept looking. He was still working it out when the trees closed behind him, and the whispering wood gave him nothing more to see. 14 days of reports, none of them adequate. The first riders from the Neck had brought dispatches written in the language of men trying to describe something they had no words for. Tywin had read them 3 times, set them aside, read them again the following morning with the clean attention of a night's sleep behind him, and found on the third reading not information about a weapon, but information about the limits of his scout's comprehension, which was itself information, and he filed it accordingly. Mern's report was better. A professional soldier with a professional soldier's vocabulary, delivering the facts in sequence without decoration. 1 sound. 1 bolt through 5 men and their horses in a line. 6 machines in the Neck's reed grass with independent operators. He had the frame size from Mern's hands held apart in the lamplight. He had spent 3 days doing the mathematics of what that frame size implied about tension ratios and bolt weight, and the force of a release at full tension. The mathematics were not comforting. He had chosen Harrenhal because no army had successfully assaulted it since the conquest. Not sentiment. Logic, its towers stood over 150 feet at their highest point. Its walls were 40 feet thick in places, the stone laid by 40 years of slave labor under a king who had been trying to build something that could not be taken. Harren had been wrong about one thing. Dragons. There were no dragons. Tywin had issued 3 orders and gone to bed. No sallies. No negotiations. Double the garrison on the outer towers facing the Riverland's approach. He had run the firing angles from Mern's size estimate and concluded the outer towers were the obvious targets, the largest mass, the most structurally significant, the first thing a sensible commander would address. His engineers agreed. He had noted their agreement and gone to bed and slept 6 hours, because 6 hours was what he allowed and what he took, and he did not revise this under any circumstances that did not involve immediate personal danger. He woke at gray dawn and went to the map room and waited. He was wrong about the towers. He would not know this for several hours. They arrived at mid-morning. No encirclement. No formal siege lines at arrow range. No cavalry ahead of the machines, he noted this specifically, because cavalry ahead meant you intended to exploit a breach, and cavalry behind the machines meant you expected the machines to produce the breach, and wanted the horses rested for what followed. The army positioned itself across the Harrenhal approach at 300 yards with the unhurried precision of something that had been doing this for months, and had found the pace of it unremarkable. Tywin stood at the window of the main keep's upper room, the room from which he had managed the Westerlands Riverlands campaign for 9 weeks, and watched them deploy and catalogued what he could see, and said nothing. His maester was behind him. His 2 lords in waiting were behind him. The room was still. The machines stopped. The army stopped. Then the sound arrived. He felt it first through the boots, a vibration in Harrenhal's ancient stones, rising from deep in the foundation and traveling up through 40 feet of wall and across the keep's floor and into the soles of his feet, where it registered not as sound but as pressure. His legs absorbed it before his ears resolved what it was. Then both happened simultaneously, the low mechanical resonance completing itself in the air, one sustained note held at the boundary between sound and force, and the release, the crack arriving at full weight across 300 yards without diminishing the way sound was supposed to diminish, hitting the keep's stones and passing through them and continuing into his chest. He had the thought, this is what Mern could not describe. Then he heard the impact. Not on the outer towers. On the eastern curtain wall, the junction point where the eastern tower met the main wall, where old First Men stonework transitioned into Harren the Black's overlay. The joint. The load-bearing seam that connected 2 different centuries of construction and bore the weight of both. He had doubled the garrison of the wrong towers. He did not move from the window. He did not speak. He listened to the second bolt cycle, loading, tensioning, the mechanical rhythm of the sequence, and arrive at the same junction, 6 feet lower. The third, lower still, each impact reaching him through the floor, through the soles of his boots, through his legs, arriving as a physical fact before his mind had fully processed the previous one. He counted the intervals, measured the rate, ran the calculation of what a sustained operation at this rate would produce, against a junction built on the specifications of 8,000 years ago. He found the answer in 3 minutes. The answer was not acceptable. He was still working on a countermove when the eastern outer tower began to lean. 1 degree, perhaps 2, invisible to anyone not watching precisely, and Tywin was watching precisely. He felt the lean through the floor before he saw it through the window, a subtle shift in the vibration's quality as the tower's mass began transferring its load in a direction it had not been designed to transfer it. His maester behind him opened his mouth to say something. Tywin raised one hand, and the room went back to silence. The 7th bolt. 8, 12. At the 15th shot the lean was undeniable, 3 degrees and visible to anyone standing at any window in the keep. At the 20th, loose stone had begun to fall from the junction face, not dramatically, not in the way of imminent collapse, but with the quiet, deliberate motion of a structure releasing its grip on what it could no longer hold. At the 22nd bolt, the eastern face of the tower fell. Not a crumble, not a slow dissolution into components. The entire face, 40 feet high, 15 feet across, came away from the base in one piece, toppling outward the way a door comes off its hinge when the pin is finally pulled, and it struck the Harrenhal yard below with a sound and a vibration that were not separable from each other, that arrived as a single fact throughout every stone in the castle and through 2 of his lords in waiting backward, without their deciding to move. Dust, the color of pulverized northern granite in lamplight, brownish-gray, rising from the impact in a slow, enormous column, and spreading outward in a circle that moved faster than dust had any right to move, blurring the view through the window, swallowing the yard below. Through the gap where the tower face had been, he could see the interior. The staircases. The garrison room he had doubled. Rubble, the men he had placed there were in the dust cloud somewhere. He stood at the window and looked at this. He heard the second machine cycling. Through the dust. Patient and mechanical and entirely indifferent to what had just happened, cycling through its sequence toward the next junction. His maester said, very quietly, "My lord." The garrison, how many men were stationed in the eastern? Tywin raised his hand. He stood at the window for 3 minutes. He thought about flanking. He thought about capturing an engineer. He thought about the gold in Casterly Rock and whether any sum of it could reach a Glover or a Forrester before the second machine reached the next junction. He thought about the political instruments, the Boltons, the Freys, the question of northern unity. He thought about mobile war, open field engagements where the machine's advantage was reduced by terrain. He found no move that worked in the time he had. He turned from the window. He said, very quietly, to the room, "Open the gates." They met in the Harrenhal yard in the shadow of the intact towers. Tywin had put on his armor. Not from vanity, he had worn armor into significant moments his entire career, because the armored man and the unarmored man were received differently, and he was surrendering a position, not a character. His sword was sheathed. The sheathing was deliberate. Every deliberate thing he did was a message, and this one was legible to anyone paying attention. Robb Stark rode through the gate with 6 riders and dismounted. Tywin noted this. He had expected the boy to stay mounted. He had chosen not to, which was either instinct or counsel, and either way it meant something. He was 15 years old. Ned Stark's jaw. Tully coloring. A riding cloak carrying 6 weeks of Riverland's mud on its lower quarter. Eyes that looked at Tywin Lannister without producing the anxiety that Tywin Lannister's presence had been engineered, through 6 decades of careful precision, to produce. Tywin said, "How old are you?" "Old enough," Robb said. "That weapon." A pause, measured, who built it? "A man named Brandon," Robb said. "About 8,000 years ago." "And where has it been?" Tywin said. "For 8,000 years." "Waiting," Robb said. Tywin was quiet. A full, deliberate silence. Not the silence of a man without an answer, the silence of a man who has found one and is determining what it costs him to hold it. "For what?" he said. Robb's eyes moved past Tywin's shoulder, up and out through the gate to the wall breaker on its platform, the ironwood frame dark against the gray sky, motionless. "Aimed at nothing yet." "Not Lannisters," Robb said. Tywin followed the look. He looked at the machine against the sky, and at the junction points it had not yet touched, and he thought about the design logic of something that fired obsidian-tipped bolts at load-bearing seams rather than at the obvious mass of towers, and he thought about what enemy required that level of architectural specificity in a weapon. And he arrived at the answer the way he arrived at all answers, directly, without sentiment, and without the comfort of pretending he had not arrived there. He turned back. "My terms require my men leave with their arms," he said. "Your men leave with their lives," Robb said. "That's the term." Tywin looked at him, made the calculation, filed it. "Yes," he said. That evening, when the Lannister garrison had cleared through the southern gate, and the northern engineers walked Harrenhal's remaining walls with their chalk and their diagrams, and the unhurried attention of men identifying the next thing to be dismantled, Robb stood on the battlements and looked down into the great yard. The melt lines were there, running down the bases of the 5 towers in long, dark streaks, the stone where Balerion's fire had found it 300 years ago and done what dragon fire did at the temperature only a dragon could produce. Long, smooth, permanent scars in the stone, lighter in color than the surrounding granite. The mark of something that burned hotter than anything in the world had a right to burn. Harrenhal had been made famous by fire, by something that came from the sky and answered to no law of war that the world had known before it. He put his hand on the battlement's edge. The stone was cold, the same cold the vault held, the same cold the ironwood carried from the deep earth, the same cold that had been waiting in the lower crypts of Winterfell. Sealed behind a deliberate wall of granite, patient for 8,000 years or until someone needed it, whichever came first. He gave the order to move south in 4 days. The letter had come in Tywin's hand. That was the first fact. Tywin had written it himself, which meant it contained something he did not want traveling through a maester's chain. Which meant the contents were either sensitive or damaging, or both, which was already more information than the letter's single sentence provided on its own. Tyrion had read it in the 30 seconds between breaking the seal and the candle going out when the draft came under the door. "They have siege engines of a kind I have not seen. Harrenhal's eastern towers are down. I am their guest. Think. 3 facts and an instruction. Their guest." That was the phrase. Not prisoner. Tywin would not write prisoner, not in his own hand, not in a letter that could be intercepted and read at a dozen points on its journey south. Guest was doing the work that prisoner would have done if Tywin had been any other man, and because it was Tywin, it was both dignity and strategy simultaneously. And Tyrion spent 4 minutes with the word before setting it in the category of things too large to carry while working. He sat in his tower room. A candle burned. A jug of arbor red sat at his elbow. He thought. That was what the letter had told him to do. He did it without ceremony, without the pause for self-pity that the situation would have warranted in a lesser man, and without the pause for panic that it warranted in any honest man. He set the fact of Tywin's capture to the side. He thought about what he had. The city walls, the garrison, the grain stores bought with gold no longer paying for Lannister armies currently not arriving, the Alchemists' Guild and its particular expertise, which he had been managing for 3 months since discovering that Cersei had commissioned thousands of jars of wildfire and then forgotten to specify what for. He sent for the chief alchemist before the candle had burned down a 1/4 inch. The ditches took 11 days. 3 of them, crossing the Mudgate approach at 40-yard intervals, each 6 feet deep and 12 wide. The clay hard below the topsoil and requiring picks where shovels failed. The workers were told they were drainage improvements. The lie held long enough. When the guild's clay jars began arriving in covered wagons, some workers went home and some stayed, and Tyrion chose not to examine the reasons of those who stayed too closely, because he needed them, and examination was a luxury for men with more options. The pitch fuse ran from the leading jar of each ditch, back up the approach road, to a position below the Mudgate's inner arch. 1 man with a torch could ignite all 3 in under a minute. Tyrion had drilled the man. He had also made sure the man could run, which was the kind of practical detail that separated planning from wishful thinking. The logic was sound. Everything the guild had confirmed and every material test he had run pointed the same direction. Ironwood resisted ignition at normal fire temperatures in a way that made it almost impractical to burn. But wildfire burned at temperatures normal fire temperatures could not approach. Long enough exposure, and nothing organic could answer it. Dense, low moisture, slow to catch, meant the machines would need to be inside the ditch line when ignition occurred. Inside, stationary, and committed to the approach. He stood on the Mudgate rampart in the cold morning before the host arrived, and looked at the ditches and the approach road, and ran the calculation one final time. He was fairly sure it was correct. He had also been fairly sure of calculations before. The host arrived at midday. He watched them deploy and did what he had done in every difficult situation since childhood. He narrated the facts clinically, without the emotional register, which created a useful distance between what was happening and what it meant for him personally. The engines came forward to 200 yards and stopped. He counted 12. 2 of the larger machines, much larger, wider platforms, a different mechanism folded back against the frame, positioned wider than the others. Not opposite the gate. Opposite the ditch line. He noted this. He was still noting it when the first scorpion bolt hit the mud gate. The gate held. Triple-layered oak with iron banding. The inner layer ironwood installed at his specific instruction 3 weeks ago when the neck reports had begun arriving, paid for at a rate that would have offended Tywin and did not offend Tyrion because Tyrion had spent his life making peace with what things cost. The bolt buried itself in the outer layer and stopped, which was the designed outcome, which meant the outer layer was working, which he permitted himself half a second to appreciate before the second bolt arrived. He gave the signal. The torchman at the inner arch lit the first ditch. The wildfire rose with the sound it always rose with, not the crack of a fire catching, not the roar of something burning, but a low concussive pressure that preceded the light by half a second. The air moving outward from the ditch as something felt before it was heard. Then the green. The color that had no equivalent in nature, the burning of something achieved at temperatures nature had never independently produced, running the ditches full length in one continuous motion, too fast for spreading, and too structured for explosion. It turned the Mudgate approach into a different world. Green stone. Green wall. His own hands on the rampart, looking down, resolving in green. The air smelling of something between sulfur and the inside of a hot forge, the smell that meant wildfire was doing what wildfire did, which was burn until there was nothing left to burn at whatever it had found. For 3 seconds, the calculation had worked. Then, the wall breaker fired. He saw the cask in the air. Briefly, in the green light, a clay vessel the size of a man's torso, tumbling end over end, in a low arc from the wide platform 200 yards back. He had time to understand what it was before it landed. He had time to understand that the wide positioning, the different mechanism, the casks instead of bolts. That all of this had been worked out before the host left Harrenhal, that someone south of the wall had read the wildfire intelligence and had already answered it, that the answer was in the air right now. The cask hit the center of the second ditch. For 1 second, the green blazed brighter. Contact, the wildfire reaching for new fuel. Recognizing the clay vessel's contents as something it could use. 1 second of green more intense than anything the ditch had produced on its own. Then it stopped. Not faded. Not diminished by competing fuel. Stopped, the green extinguished at the point of contact as if someone had made a decision about it, and the white took its place. Rising from where the cask had opened with a quality of light that had no reference point in anything Tyrion had ever seen burning. Not warm white. Not the white of a furnace or a forge, or any legitimate form of fire. Cold white. The color of something that burned without producing heat, spreading from the contact point in both directions along the ditch and consuming the green as it traveled. Replacing it section by section until the second ditch was entirely white and the green was gone. The white burned the stone of the approach road. He looked at his hands. The white light made them the color of something dead. The third ditch was behind him, unlit, still waiting. He watched the white fire and made the decision not to light it. He already knew what it would do, and what it would do was not what he had designed it to do. He sent the runner with the abort signal anyway. Then he stayed on the rampart for 4 hours, because leaving would not have changed anything, and he wanted to understand what he was watching well enough to explain it later, under better conditions, to someone worth explaining it to. The scorpions continued their sequence on the gate. The gate held until dusk. Not from the bolts. The bolts had worked through the outer layer and the second layer, and the ironwood third layer had done what ironwood did. Had resisted, and resisted in the specifically ironwood way of resistance that wasn't defiance, but density. The resistance of something that simply was what it was at a molecular level and could not be otherwise. It caught at the 4th hour when the Frostfire compound reached the gate's base through a crack in the approach stone and found the timber's lowest edge and began the slow ignition of something dense enough to fight it for a long time, but not dense enough to win indefinitely. The burning was white all the way through. No char smell, no wood smoke. Something colder that dispersed fast and left behind an iron forge smell with nothing beneath it. No wood, no pitch, no organic residue of the thing that had burned. The gate came down at dusk in 3 pieces. The first northern soldiers to enter King's Landing walked through the aftermath in the gray evening. The approach stone was bleached where the Frostfire had run, pale, cold, the color of old bone in poor light, clean in a way that fire's aftermath was not usually clean. Where the wildfire ditches had been, the stone was darker beneath, the green's residue still present but muted, overlaid and suppressed, resolving into a color that had no name because no one had ever needed a name for it before. One soldier stopped, not an engineer, not anyone's son of consequence, a spearman from one of the smaller houses, carrying a spear the way a man carried something he had been carrying for 6 months and had stopped consciously registering. He crouched at the edge of the bleached stone and picked up a fragment from the approach. A piece of the obsidian bolt casing, shattered against the gate's iron banding, lying in the Frostfire stone as if it had been there since the road was laid. Black glass, dense and cold, still warm from neither the battle nor the white fire, because the white fire had not made anything warm. He held it up in the gray evening light. He could see himself in it. Sharply and clearly, the way still water showed you yourself on cold mornings. A northern soldier, 6 months from home, standing in a city that had not been taken in 300 years, holding a piece of volcanic glass that had come from a vault sealed 8,000 years before he was born. He looked at the reflection for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and walked into King's Landing. Behind him, the Frostfire burned on in the ditches, low and cold and patient, needing nothing from the evening air. The engines were already in the yard when the sun came up. He had given the order the night before the mud gate had fully cleared, before the Frostfire had stopped burning in the approach ditches, before anyone had slept. Move the wall breakers into the outer courtyard. Move 2 scorpions to the inner gate. Position the 3rd wall breaker opposite the Maegor's holdfast drawbridge, opposite the single entrance of the castle within the castle, where the queen and the king and whatever remained of the Lannister court had retreated when the gate came down at dusk. Point it there. Do not fire it. He hadn't slept. He'd sat in a commandeered room on the Red Keep's outer ring and worked through dispatch after dispatch, from the Great Yon at the city's north gate, from Galbart Glover managing the supply column, from 3 lords with questions that could have waited until morning but hadn't, because men with questions in unfamiliar territory always found it difficult to wait. He answered them all in the flat language he had been developing for 6 months, the language that gave you what you needed, and left the rest of the sentence empty. Then he went to the window and looked at the Maegor's holdfast across the yard in the dark. The drawbridge was up. The holdfast lights were burning. Someone awake in there, working the same night he was, with worse options. He thought, this ends today. Then he thought, not the way people think it ends. Tywin Lannister came out at the 3rd hour of morning. He came alone. The holdfast gate opened, and he crossed the drawbridge. They had lowered it themselves, which was a signal, in his hands chain worn over traveling clothes, which was either habit or the last available performance of a man whose performances had run short of material. He stopped in the yard and looked at the wall breaker for a full 10 seconds. Not with fear, or not only with fear. With something adjacent to appreciation, the look of a man encountering something intellectually considerable under circumstances that prevented him enjoying it properly. Robb walked out to meet him. They stood in the cold morning, with the wall-breaker behind Tyrion, and the holdfast behind Tyrion, and the entire city behind Robb, and for a moment neither spoke. "I've been thinking," Tyrion said, "about what you want." "You've been thinking since Harrenhal," Robb said. "Since the neck, actually." The pause of a man who had prepared this and was deciding whether to deliver it straight. He took it straight. "You have my father. You have my brother. You have King's Landing. What you don't have is a kingdom. The city is yours. The realm is watching. You need someone to tell the realm that what you're sitting on is legitimate and not merely spoils. And you're offering to be that someone. I'm offering to be useful." He looked up at Robb with the eyes of a man who read faces the way other men read contracts, looking for the clause that would end him. Not from loyalty. Let's not insult each other with that word. From the recognition that you are the winning position, my lord, and I have spent my entire life aligning myself with winning positions before the loss becomes total. Robb looked at the small, precise face, the mismatched eyes, one green, one black, the intelligence sitting in them like something banked rather than burning, conserving its heat. "Joffrey," Robb said. The word landed. Tyrion's expression had already shifted before it arrived, had shifted in the fraction of a second of anticipation, which was itself a form of information about how his mind worked. "Yes," Tyrion said. Obviously they brought Joffrey into the outer courtyard at midday. No crowd. The lords who needed to witness, the maester who needed to record, the guard who needed to manage. He had been raised by a man who believed that death administered by law required the full weight of law's attention and the theater of none of it, and he had taken this on faith for 15 years without fully understanding it, and understood it now. The charges were read by the Red Keep's own maester, Lannister record, not Northern record. The legitimacy running through their own chain. Conspiracy against the succession of Westeros. The falsification of the royal lineage. The illegal arrest and execution of Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North, Hand of the King. The maester read them in a voice that had found a position somewhere between official and barely adequate, the voice of a man doing what was required of him in a situation that had outrun his training entirely. Joffrey stood in the yard and said nothing. He was 13. He had his mother's coloring and his real father's jaw, though he would never know that. And it showed in his face now in a way the portraits had not showed it. Perhaps it was the morning light. Perhaps it was that the performance had finally run out of room, and what was underneath it was just a 13-year-old boy who had never been told he was not what he believed himself to be. He said nothing. The northern headsman's axe was old and plain and had no name. Robb had been asked whether there was a Valyrian steel blade available, and had said no. Ice was gone. He was not going to use something that aspired to Ice's place. He was going to use an axe, because an axe was what law used when law was doing its work without interest in its own mythology. It was over before the courtyard had time to become anything other than cold and quiet. He looked at the yard stone for a moment. Then he looked away. He did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had expected the thing that came with endings, the release, the resolution that arrived when justice was done. What arrived instead was a flat quiet, like the whispering wood after the last engine had stopped cycling, a silence full of things that had been and no longer were. He thought about his father. He stopped thinking about his father. Cersei Lannister came into the throne room in the late afternoon as if she had decided on the timing herself. She wore green and gold, which was either deliberate or the only clothes she had packed before the mudgate came down, and she wore them the way she wore everything, as though the room had been arranged to receive her. As though the arrangement of any room was always contingent on her presence in it. She stopped in the center of the floor. Robb sat in a camp chair, not the Iron Throne. He had looked at it when the room was empty, had stood before it, and given it the attention it was owed as a thing that had organized several hundred years of war and succession, and the particular human obsession with sitting higher than everyone else, and had felt nothing about it except the specific nothing of something that had nothing to do with him. He had pulled the camp chair from his command kit and placed it in the space between the dais and the room's center and sat in it. The proportions were wrong, the room built for something grander. He did not care. She looked at the chair. Then, at him in it. Something moved in her face and resolved into a quality that was not contempt and not surprise, but the precise point between them. He told her the terms: trial, which she would lose; execution, which she refused before he had finished saying the word; or exile, a ship, a small household, whatever portion of Essos she chose. She stood in the center of the throne room and said nothing for a very long time. When she spoke, it was in the voice underneath the other voices, the one not designed for effect, the one that came from whatever was real in her, which he had been told existed and was now watching. "Your father was a good man," she said. "You are not your father." She did not mean it as a compliment. She meant it as an assessment delivered with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years making assessments and had gotten very good at the ones that landed in the place between observation and wound. "I know," Robb said. She looked at him. At the camp chair, at the iron throne behind his right shoulder, sitting in the room's elevated dark the way it always sat. Massive. Cold. Built from the swords of 1,000 defeated enemies, belonging to a story that was not his and that he did not want. Then she left to arrange her household. The oaths came in the evening, as the light through the throne room's high windows went the color of old pewter. Lords and household heads and one Lannister appointed port official who had managed to remain useful across the transition. Each one brought forward, each one delivering the words in the voice of a man doing what survival required, without having yet worked out how he felt about it. Robb received them in the camp chair, which they all looked at and none of them mentioned. When the last one had left, and the doors had been sealed, and the room was empty, he sat in the cold with the sounds of the engines coming through the high windows, the creak of ironwood frames settling in the evening, the slow respiration of something that had no need of rest, patient and dense, waiting in the yard as it had been waiting since the Winterfell courtyard 7 months ago. The sound had not changed. 700 miles of road, and it was still the same sound, unchanged by anything that had happened under it. He thought about Bran in the lower crypts, the cold rising through the vault floor, the look on Bran's face in the torchlight when he first touched the numbered ironwood frames. Not wonder, not discovery. Recognition. The look of someone seeing a thing they had been shown in a dream and were now confirming in the waking world. He thought about Lewin's voice, running through the leather diagrams, arriving at something that had stopped him cold. "These aren't blueprints, my lord. They are instructions. Instructions, written by someone who knew what was coming and knew it would come again and sealed them in the bedrock of Winterfell for the person who would need them next. Not for a war against Lannisters, not for this, for something else, for what had been waiting in the dark at the top of the world since before the Andals crossed the narrow sea, before the first men themselves had memory of their own beginning. He sat in the camp chair in the empty throne room and let that land the way it needed to land. The door behind him opened, the rookery runner. The look of someone carrying something they did not understand. He held out the Raven's message capsule, and Robb took it and broke the seal. He read it. He read it again. Outside, the engines settled in the cold, their ironwood frames going still in the dark yard of a city that had not been taken in 300 years, patient as something that had been patient for 8,000, and was prepared, if necessary, to be patient for 8,000 more. He read Jon's letter a third time, not because the words had changed, because the third reading was the one where information stopped being information and started being fact, and the distinction mattered in a way he could not have explained 6 months ago, and could not have avoided explaining now. The throne room had emptied 2 hours ago, the candles had burned to their last quarter-inch, and the iron throne at the far end sat in the dark the way it always sat, massive and cold, and waiting for the next person to need it. The camp chair was still positioned between the dais and the room's center. He sat in it with his boots flat on the stone, and the letter unrolled across his knee, and the sound of the engines coming through the high windows, their ironwood frames settling in the cold of the night. Jon's letters were always short. Jon had given you the fact and left the inference to you since they were children, which Robb had found irritating when they were growing up and found differently now. The wall is changing. The ranging parties were not coming back, not all of them, some had returned, And the ones who returned said what men said when they had seen something they could not explain. They said nothing. They stared past you, they ate the first warm food they'd had in weeks without tasting it. The Fist of the First Men, the high ground north of the wall where 300 men had been based, had been found empty and wrong. Wrong in the specific way places went wrong when something had happened there, and the thing that had happened left no survivors to describe it. Only marks in the snow, moving away from the Fist in every direction. Not animal, not human, not quite either. Sam Tarly had seen one at the Fist, north of the wall, and driven a dragonglass blade through it before it reached him. It had stopped. The dragonglass was not enough. Not because they lacked supply. Stannis had delivered 17 casks of worked obsidian 3 weeks past. Not enough because a man with a dragonglass dagger could kill what stood immediately in front of him, and what was coming did not come from the front. It came from every direction, and did not stop when you killed the nearest ones, and the arithmetic did not resolve in your favor. Jon's last line, 4 words. Send the engineers. Robb set the letter down. He sat in the empty throne room and let the meaning settle the way settlement happened, not all at once but in stages, each one revealing what had been true before the recognition arrived. The obsidian tips. He had watched the bolts go through stone for 6 months. He had watched the tip fracture on impact and the ironwood shaft carry the force through and beyond. Against living men in armor, obsidian was impractical. It shattered on plate, lost its edge on hardened steel. Every military engineer south of the wall would tell you this. Obsidian was a primitive material. The material of people who had not yet discovered iron. Against the dead, Sam Tarly had put an obsidian blade through something that was walking after it should have been still. And it had stopped. The bolts were not designed for stone. The understanding arrived the way all the real understanding had arrived in this campaign, not as revelation, but as confirmation of something that had been true the entire time and had simply required the right moment to resolve itself. Obsidian tips, because obsidian stopped what iron could not. Ironwood shafts, because the delivery mechanism needed to sustain a rate of fire sufficient for an enemy that did not rout, that did not panic, that did not begin calculating its survival odds when the numbers turned. Rate of fire. Coverage. The wall breakers' wide platforms. The cask delivery. The frost fire that suppressed hostile fire rather than producing it. The others moved with cold. Not the cold of winter, but something older. Something that worked on fire the way it had worked on the wildfire ditches at the Mudgate. The frost fire burned cold. It answered cold. He had used it against alchemists' fire and green wildfire channels, which had worked, but which was not the purpose it had been built for. He sat with this until the candles finished. Then he stood. The courtyard was dark and still, and the engines were motionless on their platforms. He crossed to the lead Scorpion, the first one, the machine that had been in the Winterfell courtyard the morning they tested the prototype, that had rolled south through the Neck and the Twins and the Whispering Wood and Harrenhal's yard and the Mudgate's white fire, and had arrived here with its numbered joints intact and its tension assembly calibrated exactly as the leather diagrams specified. He put his hand on the ironwood frame. Cold. Always cold. He had noticed this in the Winterfell courtyard 7 months ago and had not thought about what it meant. Ironwood held cold the way metal held cold, not because of the temperature of the air around it, but because of the density. It took on the cold of deep places and kept it. The vaults cold. The crypts cold. The cold 8,000 years deep in the bedrock beneath Winterfell, where Brandon the Builder had sealed a room and left numbered pieces in the dark and written instructions, in a notation no one born after the long night had been taught. He thought about Bran in the torchlight. Not wonder. Recognition. The face of a boy confirming something he had been shown in a dream. The three-eyed crow had managed the interval. 8,000 years of Starks walking past the vault entrance without knowing, until the one who needed to know was born and fell from a tower and was shown the way down. That was not accident. That was design of a different kind than the engines, slower, less legible, working in generations rather than tension ratios, but design nonetheless. He pulled his hand from the frame. He called his generals. Tywin Lannister received the news in the room he had commandeered near the small council chamber, surrounded by 3.5 maps empty cup of arbor red. He listened to what Robb told him without interrupting, which was the most disciplined thing Robb had seen him do. He asked 2 questions. Logistics first, supply chains, grain allocation, the city's rate of consumption against the column's departure timeline. Then the personal question, what the arrangement required of him in Robb's absence. Robb told him. Tyrion was quiet. Regent, he said, not with pleasure, not with pride. With the resignation of a man handed a problem he is uniquely qualified to solve, and has not yet determined whether that is fortune or its opposite. You said you wanted to be useful, Robb said. I did. He looked at the maps. I generally regret saying it. Robb left him with the wine and the maps and the specific difficulty of administering a city whose political framework had been replaced inside a week. Jaime Lannister came to him. Not summoned. He walked into the outer yard where the column was forming, still technically a prisoner, and stopped in front of Robb and looked at the engines being loaded for the northward march, and then at Robb, and then at the letter still in Robb's hand. How many, he said. Robb told him what Jon had written. Jaime was still for a moment. The specific stillness he had developed since the Whispering Wood, since lying on his back in the leaves counting engine cycles, the stillness of a mind that had found something worth understanding and was not going to stop until it did. Then I'll fight, he said. Not from loyalty, not from conversion. From the only logic that survived when every other calculation had been cleared away, there was an enemy. It was real, and he was the finest swordsman alive standing in front of a man who had the means to bring it to ground. Robb looked at him for a moment. Unshackle him, he said. His mother rode up alongside him as the first engine cleared the city's northern gate, and they rode together in the sound of the column without speaking. 12 scorpions and 4 wall breakers on their ironwood wheels. 18,000 pairs of boots on the King's Road. Ravens going north ahead of them in dozens, carrying word to Jon, to the wall, to whatever waited beyond it. She had not asked if he was certain. She had stopped asking somewhere south of the neck. She looked at the road and said, Your father would have turned north first. He thought about this. I know, he said. He would have left the Lannisters for later. I know that too. A pause. The engines creaked behind them. He would have been wrong, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the road ahead. Her face carried what 6 months of campaign had made of it, not harder, but stripped of the layers that peace maintained between a face and the facts it was looking at. The Lannisters would have followed him, harried his supply line from the south, while the dead pressed from the north. He would have had no room. A pause. You made room first. Robb said nothing. They rode north. Brandon the Builder made the wall, and Brandon the Builder made the engines. And the order was the thing Robb kept returning to. The wall first. Permanent, enormous, a structure that announced its own insufficiency by existing, because you did not build a 700-foot barrier of ice and magic and old intention unless you understood that what you were holding back would eventually find a way through it. The wall was a delay. The longest, most expensive, most deliberate delay in the history of the world, maintained by the Night's Watch across 8,000 years of incremental forgetting until the Watch had forgotten even why they stood. Then the engines. Sealed into the bedrock beneath Winterfell with numbered pieces and leather diagrams and clay vessels of frostfire, waiting for the delay to expire. Waiting for the person who would need them to be born, fall, dream, descend, and bring them into daylight. 2 weapons, 1 problem, 8,000 years between them. He had used the second weapon to clear the path to the first. The Lannisters had been in the way, genuinely in the way, not incidentally, because you could not hold the wall from the south if the south was controlled by men who would use the wall's struggle as a political instrument rather than a military one. The campaign had been necessary. He had not misread it. But he had not read it completely. He read it completely now. The King's Road opened north under the column's weight. The ironwood frames carried their deep cold into the open air, darker than the surrounding gray, dense against the sky. The ravens had gone ahead of him by miles now, gone north toward Jon at Castle Black, toward the 700 feet of ice that had been holding a door shut for 8 millennia, toward whatever moved on the far side of it in the dark and the cold, and the silence, where ranging parties did not return. Beside him, his mother rode without speaking. Behind him, Jaime Lannister rode unshackled in the column with the specific attention of a man cataloging the engine's assembly for the third time. Ahead, the wall waited in his imagination. Not the monument he had grown up imagining, not the boundary of the world, but a tool. The first tool. The tool that bought time for the second. He thought about Bran in the deep crypts, hand on the cold ironwood in the torchlight, looking at him with eyes that came from somewhere below the place where a 7-year-old boy's sight usually stopped. We need to tell Robb both things. Both things. The weapons and the raven. The tool and the reason the tool existed. He had carried both things south. He was carrying them north now. The north is cold and full of whispers. And the whispers, finally, have an answer. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.